No! News busted! Look at this guy's face! Look at him! Oh, he's gonna tell you something really cheeky. He's a cheeky boy. This cheeky boy is gonna tell you some cheeky stuff. Can you guess what he's gonna say? I think I know, because I uploaded it.
Now, the possibility that the COVID-19 virus leaked from a laboratory should not be ruled out. That's a...
Anybody who'd know my work would know that that scream was real. It was real frustration. Real frustration. Real frustration. Because, of course, anybody who's read The Welcome Fire, the proximal origin of COVID control will know that I examined the people who did the cover-up of that, who did all of that. The Jeremy Farrar, Edward C. Holmes, Andrew Rambeau, and Gary and other people who were intimately involved in this, intimately involved in the cover-up of COVID-19 origins. And this is the BBC finally reporting that it's not a conspiracy theory after trying to say it's a conspiracy theory for the previous 2 years. This is the BBC starting to have to say the truth. And it's only been a couple of years.
According to a former top Chinese government scientist who's been speaking to the BBC, George Gao was director of the Chinese Centre for Disease Control for much of the pandemic and has told a new BBC podcast that the question of the virus's origin remains...
They're even plugging! They're using it to plug a new BBC podcast! It's a new BBC podcast! Hey, we're telling the truth on a new BBC podcast! We're launching this new BBC podcast with the truth! That's what we're going to do, especially only for the first episode. You're going to get the truth about what actually happened in Wuhan. And then after that, we'll continue to see a narrative in your brain. And if you don't take it, then we'll call you names and we'll try and ruin your career, because that's what we do with the BBC. 17 seconds in, for fuck's sake. They only say accidental. Again, this is going down into another them creating another conspiracy. Must have been an accidental leak. But what if it was leaked on purpose? Oh, conspiracy on top of conspiracy on top of conspiracy on top of conspiracy on top of conspiracy. It's why we're the BBC. That's what we do.
In China until he was forced to leave in 2021. He sent this report from New York.
They were even able to force in, look, he was forced to leave China. They don't say why he was forced. What was it? Was it because of COVID regulations, or was it because the Chinese are such nasty authoritarians? You want to carefully say it so that it's propaganda. This is so... He's used words within the first 37 seconds. He's implied and stuck in your brain about 4 or 5 different things that don't follow. He's actually saying don't necessarily mean that those things are connected. He's thrown them in there just to say, look, these things. Check on them. China bad.
Since the world got its first glimpse of the deadly disease circulating in Wuhan, China has dismissed the theory that COVID might have leaked from a lab known to have been experimented.
Now, look at this. Now they're talking about it. They know they're going to have to come out and admit it eventually. And they're saying, at this point, and China has always dismissed. Like, it's only China who's dismissed those. Is it only China? Is it only China who's dismissed those? Could no one else have dismissed those? Obviously, no one else would have dismissed those.
With coronaviruses as a lie. But now, one of China's most senior scientists seems far less forthright when I ask him about that possibility.
This looks like an operation from the off. This looks like an operation. This is an operation to slowly release the information that they know is got, and BBC are well involved. Their investigative journalists have found 500 times over that the lab leaks from China, but still continue to give you a false narrative. Why is that?
I haven't seen anything. A lot of people have some suspicion, but I haven't seen anything.
But nor can you rule it out?
That was amazing. Right. Look, Gao saying stuff. No, haven't seen anything. Haven't seen anything. No, haven't seen anything. Haven't seen anything. That's him seeing something.
For science, you have to keep yourself open-minded. Keep yourself open-minded means everything is possible. Don't rule out anything.
He did rule out. They ruled out everything.
Rule out anything.
Look at this dystopian way they've done this.
Was ruled out. Perhaps its association with this man helped cast it as a conspiracy theory.
Oh my God! This is so through the looking glass. Oh, this clip should be studied in universities to how much conspiracy theory they imply into it all. How much they got to push in. They can't stop themselves. They just can't stop themselves. They're the ones who made Trump into this sort of conspiracy theory idea, and now they're saying maybe it's because people made Trump out to be a conspiracy theorist. And it came from his lips that people thought it was that way. So it's because of you. You're saying it's because of you.
Have you seen anything at this point that gives you a high degree of confidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the origin of this virus?
Yes, I have.
Yes, I have, says the President of the United States.
From some Western scientists of overwhelming evidence that the virus, which started in bats, passed naturally.
It started in bats. It was tested. It was changed in the labs. It didn't necessarily start in bats. Again, that's false information seeded in. Yes, coronavirus in bats, and yes, they put it into a lab, and yes, then they tried to do. They put their jiggery pokery and took little bits out of here and little bits out of there. That's no longer in bats. That's now in labs. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying once you take all of these things out of bats, or you breed them within bats unnaturally, and you put them in a lab, there's no longer from bats. That's from a fucking lab. That's from a lab. A lab. Does this look like a lab? No, that's not a lab. That's a fucking wet market.
To humans, perhaps via other animals in a market. A route by which deadly pandemics are known to have emerged in the past.
They're still pushing this. They're still pushing this.
It was that past precedent that influenced the World Health Organization mission to Wuhan, when it too effectively ruled out a lab leak, one of the scientists tells me in an interview for our podcast.
So it ruled out, the World Health Organization ruled out something that it turns out is now true, and we're all still going to go down this road of the BBC saying you should only listen to these guys. We're now reporting that every single one of them was wrong, that we were wrong, even though we knew we were wrong at the time. And it was a state of hypernormalization where you knew we were wrong, we knew we were wrong, we knew what the situation was, everybody knew, but we all pretended, didn't we? Yes, we did.
Everyone's biased. Yes, I'm biased for...
Right! News pasty! I can say it! I gotta do it! Wait a minute! Oh, sorry. I just saw that David Bowie has come up from below the grave and he's not looking so well nowadays.
Natural origin because of everything we've seen in the past. The sheer amount of consumption of wild animal meat is such a known high-risk situation.
True. not true in this situation, is it? Yes, okay. Right, there is some chance of spread happening of disease within animals because of the hormones they feed them with, the shit they feed them with, the fact at one point they were feeding like cattle. So you got like BSE and stuff coming up. That was again using farms as a kind of lab where you put all of this sort of like testing out what happens to these cattle. And that's your guys who were doing that. So the people who were doing that were people like Roy Anderson and others who were the experts on it, and who were and his friends who were involved in doing a lot of this sort of stuff. He's Royal Society, and this woman's like saying, "Oh yeah, it's us, all of the humans, and what we do, and etc." Well, no, if you actually farm properly, you won't have all of these diseases. You won't have sick animals. Sick animals are negative for farmers, so farmers cull sick animals. They control the sickness within their own herd nearly all of the time. It's only when you've had things like foot and mouth disease released from a lab in 2000-2001. 2000 probably because the actual panel that got put together to tackle foot and mouth disease was already formed 6 months ago to look at foot and mouth disease for the first time in 30 years before it was announced that there was any foot and mouth disease around and spreading about. And then they were put in charge of the operation and they said, kill everything. Pyres full of burning animals, everything. Let's do this in a different way than we've ever done it before. We kill everything. That's what those people do, and that's what they kind of did. It went to the extremes during COVID as well. Went to the extremes. Look at this person here. They're trying to dress. They're trying to spin this. Oh, yes. This is a story about how COVID was probably from a lab leak. And what this woman's now doing is saying, because of all of the possibility that it came from the natural origins, you should listen to us with all of this spectrum of other things and follow an environmental movement based on fallacies. Now, if you want clean water, you want clean food, you want animals to be treated right, that's environmental movement that's good. That's sound. I'm with it. But the environmental movement by these freak bags, look at this person. Do you want to become this person? They don't even seem to have any type of natural facial movements. It looks like they're high.
All along, other scientists, while agreeing that COVID may well have come from animals in a market, say there's not yet enough evidence to definitively rule out the other possibility that it leaked from a lab. And with the change of presidency here in the US, that view, now somewhat freed from its political associations, has gained traction.
What? So they're saying that because of Biden being in office, and Biden being free from the political, that means that it come out. This makes no sense. They've had to jump through hoops galore, mental loops. His face, look at his face. I think that sort of like wonky smile he's got on his face suggests that he knows the bullshit, the level of complete and utter bullshit. I call news pasty on you, you lying Nazi motherfucker. This is what modern day Nazis look like. Propaganda. Or this is like the people who are feeding you this propaganda in your face, and that little wry smile on the end, is that duper's delight as well? I look out for it. People who lie and people who mislead, they always show their facial signals, and look at that. He looks like he's just sold you a pup, and he knows it.
Following a review ordered by President Biden,
unbelievable.
2 out of 8 US intelligence agencies are now said to favour a lab leak with low to moderate confidence.
The thing I like most about Biden is his transparency. Just like in the Hunter Biden laptop. No.
Welcome to The Independent Review, a weekly podcast where we bring you the latest from the world of independent journalism. Whether you're a news junkie, a curious learner, or just looking for a fresh perspective away from the corporate media, this is the show for you. So join us now as we dive into the world of independent journalism on The Independent Review.
Welcome to the Independent Review. Today we will go over clips from Johnny Vedmore, Indie News Network, Derrick, Broze with James, Corbett, Kim Iversen, and Ryan, Cristian. Let's go to our first clip from the Indie News Network.
And then we get to what I woke up to this morning, which was this story about UC Global that Bestie shared from El País. So It's pretty unbelievable, but you can read here, more than 250 extra gigabytes of files related to the surveillance of the founder. What? Huh? And then we also have Tariq Haddad, who had written a thing about the 2020 release that we talked about earlier, that Matt commented on as well, that Kathy had shared. Now we also have him commenting on this El País piece. He's written up a report, including his own original reporting on the matter. This is required reading in his opinion, and I would agree because it was really good. So let's go back there. Let's go back here. Let's go to Tariq Haddad's article and let's check out what he's talking about. But before we do that, let's go first to the El País article, because I do want to give credit to the man who wrote this article. And there's video here, and it's kind of heartbreaking, but I want to show this too. All right. So the writer is Jose Maria Irujo. I want to make sure we've got volume up. Good. And go.
Do a kickflip. That's not a kickflip. Channel your inner Rodney Mullen. Do it.
That's Stella.
Hello.
Jesus. Well, thank you to El País for giving us that, and to the Ecuadorian embassy. I mean, to, you know, the UC Global case that's going on in Spain. And we'll have that.
Grab asked how recent the footage is.
That was from within the Ecuadorian embassy. I don't know exactly when.
So that would have been.
That would have been like before.
How long has he been in
2017.
prison for?
Well, that would have been before 2019, but I don't know exactly when. Yeah. Here's the article from El País if you want to check that out and read it. But I do want to go through.
Do the math, Rain Man.
Tariq Haddad's article, and there's David Morales. Okay, pictured at one of the company's offices with a colleague who is faceless. But that's David Morales right there. That's the guy that really rigged all this spying against Assange. Either knowingly, he had to know what he was doing by the end of it, but this is the key thing. Tariq Haddad says, Spanish police omitted a very relevant volume of material from the judge investigating spying allegations against UC Global owner David Morales, the former Spanish Marine accused of breaching Julian Assange's privacy while the WikiLeaks founder sought political asylum in Ecuador's London embassy, according to a new report in El País. An investigation into Morales was opened by Spain's Audiencia Nacional, a Madrid court with national jurisdiction to investigate major crimes, in July 2019. It came after two witnesses from UC Global, the firm contracted to provide security for the Ecuadorian embassy, approached Assange's lawyers, alleging that Morales had used this access to surreptitiously eavesdrop on Assange, his visitors, as well as meetings held with lawyers and medical professionals, and handing over the acquired materials to America's Central Intelligence Agency. Yes, this is what happened. We have to go over this. Once a criminal case was open, the premises of Morales' home and businesses were raided by Spanish police on 17 December of that year. In the process, police confiscated over 20,000 euros in cash. That's not pounds, that's euro. In cash, 2 guns with serial numbers scratched off, one of which was loaded, as well as physical files, laptops, mobile phones, and external storage devices in the form of pen drives and hard drives. Copies of the digital files were subsequently sent to the presiding judge, as well as Assange's Spanish lawyers, who trawled through the evidence to compile a criminal case. And these are the guns, and there's the serial number scratched off. You can see there in the picture.
Mm-hmm.
However, in going through the files, exceeding 1.5 terabytes of data, Assange's lawyers noted that a number of the files were corrupted in the copying process, making them inaccessible. They successfully petitioned the judge to have their own IT experts make new digital mirrors of the images of the devices in January of this year. Huh, how about that? About it. Now, according to their recent interview with El País, the lawyers made a shocking discovery once the new data had been accessed. Almost over 250 gigabytes of material originally on the devices was never included in what the judge or lawyers had received. It includes a staggering total of 551,616 files and 973 emails previously unseen. Among them is a folder titled Operations and Projects, like projectiles, in which further directories are broken down by region. Going to North America and then to USA, a folder is found within the title CIA. In there with the title CIA, in there are images and video footage from the secret surveillance undertaken in the Ecuadorian embassy. There are also files labeled Ladies' Toilet, where UC Global placed hidden microphones after learning that that's where Assange took his lawyers in an attempt to evade other forms of surveillance. Also that his lawyers were women, Jen Robinson and Amal Clooney, or Amal, I don't know what her name was before, and then later on, Stella Morris. Others were labeled Fidel, as in reference to Fidel Narvaez, the former Ecuadorian consul who attempted to help Assange escape the embassy by means of a diplomatic passport. The finding is hugely significant, although previously received files showed Morales texting his colleagues with multiple references to working with the American client, American Intelligence, and the Agency of Stars and Stripes, in addition to bank, phone, and flight records placing him in various American cities when key decisions were made. There never appeared to be an explicit reference to the CIA. That is now not the case, and it should be instrumental in proving the criminal case against Morales, as well as to the civil suit in the Southern District of New York filed against the CIA and its former director, Mike Pompeo, on behalf of Margaret Ratner Kunstler, Deborah Herbeck, John Getz, and Charles Glass as the plaintiffs. Further still, this now becomes the second instance of Spanish police appearing to obstruct the Assange investigation. Everybody obstructed the Assange investigation under orders from the U.S. and CIA. That's my own addition. That's not Tariq's assessment. In a January meeting with Assange's lawyers in Spain, Aitor Martinez told the author of this piece that following a December 2017 break-in at his firm's offices in Madrid, the ILOCAD practice set up by a former judge, Baltasar Garzón, the matter was investigated, but when Martinez followed up, police said there was no file in existence in relation to the break-in. What? Further follow-ups about this fact did not yield any additional information. But here's the cam footage of somebody breaking into these offices. These are screen grabs of CCTV footage from the law firm. We remember this. Like, we covered this. I think we covered this last year.
Maybe.
The break-in, which is believed to be carried out by professionals who use gloves and other means to avoid detection, is suspected of being linked to Morales and UC Global due to testimony provided by one of the two witnesses. Because in his statement to the Spanish court, witness 2, anonymized to protect him from potential reprisals from his former boss, said, I recall that at the end of November 2017, David Morales told the company workers that the Americans were very happy with the information that we'd supplied, but that they would need more. To this end, Morales spoke about the possibility of entering the legal offices of ILOCAD, which is the law firm which is headed by Baltasar Garzón in Madrid, given that Mr. Garzón coordinated the legal defense of Julian Assange. This would allow us to obtain information concerning Mr. Assange for the Americans. I believe we found that they had placed cameras in his office, too. 2 weeks after this conversation, the national media reported that 2 men in baklavas had entered his law offices. Remember, we reported on this. I recall that the news was shared amongst the employees in the Jerez office, and we speculated whether this could have to do with what our boss, David Morales, had suggested. Morales is currently under house arrest while being investigated for breach of privacy, violation of confidentiality of attorney-client privilege, bribery, and money laundering. Nice guy. Spanish case against him is continuing, and lawyers recently filed a request to extend the investigating period by an additional 6 months. And as we know, Assange, meanwhile, has now spent over 4 years in prison in Britain's HMP Belmarsh, Her Majesty's. HM is Her Majesty's Prison. That's what HMP stands for. Belmarsh.
Yeah.
While U.S. attempts to extradite him to the country continue. He's wanted in connection with obtaining and publishing the infamous collateral murder video, as well as U.S. military logs from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Defenders argue that the publication of these files is no different from what journalists do every day, and the prosecution is an assault on press freedoms. But the U.S., of course, says it's a violation of the Espionage Act, except that he wasn't bound by the Espionage Act, and that Assange should spend decades, if not the rest of his life, in incarceration. Support Tariq Haddad, tariqhaddad.com. That was a good article. To me, this is the smoking gun. Like, literally, this is the smoking gun.
Yeah,
they now have the video footage. We now have the video footage off of this guy's computer in a folder labeled CIA that they never gave. And now we have it. Why isn't he out right now? Why isn't he out right now? And I think Misty would totally agree with me. Here's the INN News episode where he purged the Assange files with special guest Misty Winston. Go check that out for sure. Okay. Yep. I saw a question by Crab. Where was it? Something. Now I can't find. Oh, here it is. He says, do you guys even think that if Assange gets out now, he'll be able to live the rest of his life at ease, or in his mental case gone for good? I would. No,
he's already mentally broken.
I would say that he
just had a stroke.
He needs to get out just for his physical safety.
Yes.
It makes me sad too. They've already kind of Mouse SF. Think of how much we lost with Julian out of commission. It is awful, and maybe one day But even with him out, I don't think that we would get that Julian Assange. I don't think he would go back to doing WikiLeaks, and I would totally not fault him, blame him one bit for not doing that. He's done more than enough, and he deserves to live his life in peace at this point and be out and free.
Now let's take a look at this clip from Derrick Broze in his interview with James Corbett.
Hey everyone, this is Derrick Broze of the Conscious Resistance Network, and I am here in the UK walking the streets, and I ran into this guy, Mr. James Corbett.
Wow, imagine that in the flesh.
In the flesh, in the UK. We're at the Better Way conference. We're both doing panels, we're doing talks. There's a lot of interesting conversations, transhumanism, AI, climate change, all kinds of stuff that both of our work has covered. And I'm excited for this conversation, even though we're not sure where it's going to go, because it's been 3.5 years since the first time we met in person.
Right.
And since our last interview, I'll put the link below, which we spoke in February 2020. And so much has happened since then. And I remember even in that conversation, we were sort of like, hey, you heard about this coronavirus thing happening in China? We were sort of guessing at what might be coming. I think in some cases we sort of anticipated what was coming. What has changed for you in your personal life, James? Let's step out of the work. Everybody knows what you've been up to, but like, how has COVID 1984 and everything we've witnessed changed, if it has, changed your life, your family's life, anything like that?
Of course. I mean, as people know, there were no lockdowns in Japan. There were no mandates per se, but it was the horizontal pressure of everyone. Okay, now everyone puts on their mask and everyone takes the jab and what have you. Luckily, given the fact that I'm an independent person, I'm not part of a company, I could avoid that horizontal pressure myself, but everyone around me, a lot of the people I know who are teachers in the public school system, well, we got to get the job. So a lot of people did. So of course, horrific from that sense. My own little family bubble isn't affected in that sense, but everything around changes, and there's no way you can avoid that. One of the things that I think I was most surprised by, not in Japan, I kind of would expect Japanese people would conform so easily, but around the world, the mass conformity at a flick of a switch was crazy.
Yeah, and that's in the U.S. I mean, we're here in the U.K. There were some major protests at different points in London and elsewhere, but still the minority of the rest of the people. And in the U.S., I mean, it was hard to muster up. I think the only big protests happened in L.A. and New York a year and a half into it. So definitely seemed like most people went along with it. One other question on that, like from the personal perspective, I'm curious, does your family, your wife, obviously she's aware of what you do for a living, but was she like, you were right again? I mean, is she like aware of the prescience of your work?
Not really. She really doesn't follow what I do, which is always surprising to people. For me, it's wonderful to be able to literally, like, really detach. When I turn the computer off, it's off, and I don't have to talk about this stuff. But, I mean, like everyone else, it's the constant indoctrination and propaganda and what have you. And like everyone else, with members of my family or friends, I have to negotiate each relationship in terms of, well, okay, this is what I believe, this is where I stand, I'm non-negotiable on this, where are you? And that's it's the trauma that has been caused by this incident amongst each other, right? Disrupting relationships. Now, thankfully, my family, my immediate family, even my larger family, I haven't had that kind of conflict where, I'm not speaking to you, I won't visit you, none of that garbage. But I know a lot of people have. And the amount of trauma that's been inflicted, not even talking about the health side of what's happened. And the health side is the other part of what affected me personally. Pre-2020, I was going to the gym, I was eating healthy, I was on track. I was getting ready to do my next documentary, then everything goes to hell. And the gym, you're not getting in here without a mask. Well, okay, I guess I'm not working out here anymore. Let myself go to a certain extent. I wasn't eating well, I was working too much. So that has been the personal side of this for me. And as I say, everyone has experienced trauma. The real question is, how do we heal ourselves while the world is falling apart? And that's the bigger question. That's a big question, and it's, I guess, more on the personal level. Each individual is going to have to decide how to handle that. And that is
an interesting aspect of it, like you said, the personal impact. Similar thing, Jim can't come here without masks. You know, luckily when I was in Texas or Mexico, things were not nearly as restrictive as the vast majority of the world. But still, there are changes, like not just lifestyle adjustments, dealing with all the tyranny outside, but the way it impacts our relationships. I mean, we've met so many people who, especially Canadians, who've lost family members and friends for their choices. So it seems like both of us were kind of lucky in that way, that not having too many relationships strained. You know, the other thing is, when we were last speaking, I had just released my book about technocracy and more importantly about solutions. And this is something, in addition to the conversation we just heard, technocracy, transhumanism, AI, which is now everyday thing. Yep. You've been talking about this since, you said 2007 earlier. I know you were reporting on it early in the Corbett report. How does it feel now to kind of be at a place where we're at a place with folks who, until a couple of years ago, were probably what we might call normies, right, and just average, I don't mean that in any derogatory way, just regular people going about their lives. And now we're in a room where people are like, this is a satanic agenda, and the trans, you know, things have changed. Like, how does that feel, like, from your perspective?
Obviously, it feels good to see that more people are getting this. It isn't good that it took massive trauma to get there, but perhaps it always takes some sort of form of trauma. Even in my own experience, I kind of understood that things weren't going in a good direction, but it was really probably in 2006 when I was trying to enter Canada, and I got stopped at customs, and they were going through my bag like I was a terrorist and asking me about my, oh, you're reading this book? What do you think about this book? As if it's going to reveal my terrorist intentions or something. That experience was kind of the arrow through my brain. Okay, there's something really going on here. What is actually happening? And I think it takes that kind of trauma to move people to the state where they start wondering what's happening and how they can heal from it. Yeah. So in a sense, I don't want to say it's a good thing, but at any rate, people are switching on to this. Yeah. And yes, I want to reiterate what you said. When I do say normie a lot, and yes, it certainly has that derisive connotation, but I don't want to fall into the trap of making fun of people who are crippled because someone has come up with a baseball bat and beaten their legs or something. No, obviously, I don't want to blame the victims here of this intergenerational, parasitic, elitist class preying on people. I want to empower humans to understand that they are above that parasitic class. They are actually more capable. So yes, language like that can be divisive. I use it myself. Maybe we need to come up with better terminology.
Yeah, that is interesting. You know, you mentioned language, and I was just following a conversation on Twitter that was something along the line. It was getting into the pure blood and vaxxed and just language again. And I commented on there that, for one, pure blood sure sounds like a lot of eugenics terminology to me. But also, yeah, the vaxxed things they're like, for me and my goal, and I believe yours as well, is to reach as many people as possible. And those are often people that maybe we are like, what is wrong with these people? But we still have compassion, or we hope to have compassion towards them. Can you speak to that, just the importance of us not becoming black-pilled or so, I guess, I think there's a tendency to, like, we're coming to these events, we're the enlightened ones, right? And all these sheep outside, like, how do we be careful not to fall into that trap?
Yeah, being aware of the trap for what it is probably the first step in that. And dehumanization is always the first step towards trying to eradicate the problem, if we can just get rid of these people, right? And so once we start dividing ourselves, we have done their, they, them, those work for them. Because that is, I think, the fundamental thing they're trying to do is inculcate an anti-human mindset into the public so that we desire our own death, our own enslavement. We're a cancer, we need to be eliminated, blah, blah, blah. Once we take that on board in any sense and start dividing ourselves, they win. So our win is in compassion. It is in coming together. It is in love.
Absolutely. Let's get into some fun topics, some controversial ones. The transgender topic is something you've covered to different extents, and you did questions for Corbett. I think somebody asked about it, but you've done other work linking the transgender to the transhumanism movement, which I think more and more people are becoming aware of. And I don't think it's the same as in Japan as it is in North America. It's in the U.S. mainly. It hasn't creeped into Mexico. But this conversation, like many topics I see, is just so divisive, and obviously it's a very charged topic. But from my perspective, I'm seeing the extremes on both ends kind of being the loudest voice, of course. Insanity's lost in there. The extreme of accept everybody no matter what they say, use the state to enforce it, pronouns, all this kind of thing. And if you question that in any way, you're bigoted, transphobe, etc. To the the other extent of let's ban the books, let's get the state to control what can be taught in colleges, and and maybe even some folks who have anti-LGBT feelings, who are maybe just generally against that. And then I feel like lost in the middle of that are, of course, the children and the people who are being targeted. And I'm working on a mini documentary about this. I've sat with a transgender person to kind of pose these questions and a parent, and really trying to tackle it from a nuanced perspective because it is such a complicated thing. What do you think? Like, how can we try to, for one, kind of navigate that minefield, but also help people through that see that larger agenda, the push towards transhumanism?
Right. So for me, the fundamental voluntarist principle always comes down to who has the right to do what in terms of applying force in order to make someone do something. So every time we involve the government in the conversation, we're doing something that is going to undermine voluntarist ideals. So whether that government force is to start forcing people to gender people a certain way or whatever, or the government force is to ban books or whatever it is, both ways I think are the wrong way of doing this. This has to come down to, again, navigating individual personal relationships. And personally, if I don't have any transgender friends, I don't know anyone, but if I did, and we had negotiated some relationship where you must gender me this way, maybe as a respect for a human being that I care about, I would do so. But the idea that some government is going to force me to do that or fine me or something if I don't do that, that's obviously where the rubber meets the roads on an ethical side of things. The other aspect of this that you asked about was in terms of
like I guess the culture war aspect of it, how people are getting lost in the nuanced topic of it. That's always the problem, isn't it? Nuance is the first casualty of any information war. And again, I think it's one of the things they're trying to divide us on. But the other aspect of it, yes, how do we start getting people to see sort of the bigger aspect of this agenda? And that to me is really the root of what is going on right now. It is a philosophical, ideological thing that is being pushed. This isn't some grassroots movement that just erupted naturally. It wasn't some civil rights 2.0. This is something that's being pushed by governments, corporations, media. So I think alarm bells should be ringing for everyone, including transgenders and others who are wondering about how this topic is being pushed by other people for other motives. What other motives could exist? And fundamentally, I think this comes down to breaking down philosophical, ideological identification distinctions that have existed in humanity for eons, millennia, as part of the push towards breaking down the fundamental distinction, which is called vitalism, the difference between organic life and inorganic life. That is where we are heading. Once we can start adapting our identification to anything we feel like, then it will be pushed on us that man, machine, whatever, you're a man machine. It's the same thing. That is where this is heading. How do you get people to see that? If you have good ideas of how to bring that understanding to people, I'm all ears. Yeah, I think it's the reason it feels complicated to me is, again, I'm sitting across from a transgender person, interviewing them and asking them, like, hey, what do you think about folks who say this? And they were open-minded. I also said, like, hey, I'm totally new to this, so if I say something wrong, like, please excuse me. It feels like there would be a hard, like, okay, so what do you say to folks who think that you're being fooled into eventually becoming transhumanism, right? It's so far from the reality. But to another point, like, you're a parent, I'm not a parent, but I'm an uncle 6 times over, and I look at them sort of in that way of, like, I want to make sure to protect them in whatever ways I can. And I look at the U.S. school system and just worry, like, all those things about what they're being exposed to. It seems like the state, and this, as volunteers, we know this, the state wants to get in between the relationship between parents and families. Like, they want to try to control the minds. And we're seeing that even more now. So with really scary things of gonna give you information, we won't tell your parents, we'll call you this thing, we'll give you access to this. Like, it's gotten to a very dangerous point, right? And so there are some people, even voluntarists, I'm now seeing, who are saying, this is a different thing, and I think Samuel Konkin warned about this, that, like, when you stray from libertarian means to ends, like, you're going to get somewhere different. You might think, oh, this is extreme, though, so we need to take a non-libertarian stance and say the state should do something. anything to that? I mean, we kind of touched on that, but just what do you think about that? Like that the situation gets so extreme, our principles must be sacrificed.
Right. Yes, no, it's a good point, because principles are either principles that we actually truly believe, and we believe them not just because we like that idea, but because we know them to be actually true and to reflect something real about the world. Once we start compromising on that, we are compromising on reality and on truth. If we truly, really, from the bottom of our hearts, believe that it is actual human interaction, voluntary interaction, that is the basis for real society, once we start compromising on that, then we are moving away from reality. So we cannot start compromising on our core fundamental principles. Now, it is a question, what are my core fundamental principles? Where do I actually draw lines? That's why the first thing I think people really need to start doing is drawing out, really, even physically writing it in a journal or whatever, to get it out to, where are my lines? What are my lines in the sand? What do I really believe? And once you write them down and articulate them and interrogate them, maybe I don't believe that. But once you have that down, then it's a question of, well, I don't compromise on these no matter what situation arises.
Absolutely. And I can speak to that as far as, in my mind, a red line had always been if this government starts talking about restricting travel. And when I left the U.S., I'd already planned to move to Mexico and get land. But when the whole nonsense was starting, the toilet paper was disappearing, you had the government and the U.S. starting to check license plates leaving New York to Rhode Island. I was like, okay, that's not a good sign. And then Trump started talking about we might potentially restrict interstate travel. We packed the vehicle and headed to Mexico the next day, because I knew that for me, even if the cage is the size of Texas, it's still a cage. And the other thing I think as far as principles, yes, what you said, James, guys, if you don't know your principles, if you don't even know what that means, do interrogate that. I feel like part of the issue is that people like ourselves who've come from a volunteerist background know what that means and know what we believe in, and others who have woken up the last couple of years, they might be former Democrats, progressives, left-wingers, or they're conservatives, but they don't necessarily have a principle foundation. So they haven't they haven't heard of volunteerism, and so I see that's why some of this community is reacting like, yes, more government's the answer. They'll fix it, because they don't really have the background understanding of that. How can we help our audience understand the importance of volunteerism? I know you've done content over the years, but it's in the backlog, right? How do we help people recognize the importance?
Well, first of all, everyone get out and vote DeSantis 2024. He's going to... Oh, wait, no. Of course not. That is the brick wall that we're banging our heads against, isn't it? Because for me, personally, it was the 2006 midterm elections in the U.S. where that was when I was starting to go down the rabbit hole and starting to discover something's not right here. And I remember Pelosi and the Democrats took the House. And everyone's talking, impeachment, they're going to impeach Bush, they're going to try him for war crimes, blah, blah, blah. And I remember listening to this crazy, whacked out conspiracy theorist, Alex Jones, who said, no, they're not going to do anything. It's all a political charade. It's wrestling for grown-ups. They're not going to do anything. And so I thought, here's an empirical test. Either, as I kind of thought, maybe they're going to do something. They're going to do something. And literally the first thing Pelosi came in, Speaker of the House, impeachment's off the table. We're not going to do that. We're going to move forward, blah, blah, blah. Oh, okay. I guess my political landscape, my map that I've been using all these years is wrong. What do I do now? Okay, so I reoriented myself. It took me a few years to get towards voluntarist principles and realizing that the whole governmental system, the idea, is fundamentally flawed. But once I got there, there's my principles. And from there, it's a question of articulating that to others. I think, again, like the trauma, everyone needs I won't say everyone needs the trauma, but trauma can help people learn to reality. I think political trauma can help people learn the reality of the political savior coming from on high. And the frustrating thing is watching it happen every single cycle. Don't worry, guys. It's all taken care of. Ron Paul's going to save the universe. 2012, end of the campaign. He wraps it up with the flag behind him, Republican, I can, whatever. He had this flag up and he was promoting, he put his endorsement on Romney. All of that. He denied 9/11 truth, all of that stuff. But, we can forgive that, right? Because he was mostly good on most of the things. Okay, fair enough. Ron Paul did a lot of good work in terms of spreading real messages.
He woke up a lot of people.
But as a political savior, no. And then, of course, Trump and all that nonsense that we had to put up with for years of people telling us, you don't get it, James. He's going to do it. If only he was
right.
If only he was in power during the scamdemic. Oh, wait. Yeah. So I like to think more people get shaken out every cycle.
I think so.
But more statists are being indoctrinated every single day through the public indoctrination system.
Little push and little give, yeah. So I mean, and to that point, so you've interviewed Robert F. Kennedy Jr. prior to the presidential campaign announcement. I mean, would you put that in the same category of what we just discussed?
Yeah, I would. I like a Ron Paul. He can have a great message on certain subjects, maybe not certain others. Climate, where is he on climate these days? That kind of thing. Sure, but on terms of the biosecurity and the scamdemic and all of that, great. I hope he gets some time to put that message out in front of the public. But, I mean, am I expecting that that's going to make a political difference? Not at all. Do I think he'll get within 100 miles of the White House? No. Even if he did, do I expect that he would be able to change anything, even if he was pure and wonderful? No, I don't. And I'm not saying vote Kennedy. I'm saying I hope he gets some part of this message out there, because fundamentally this is not a political war. It is an ideological war. And the more we can have real information, real truth put in front of people, I really believe people resonate with truth. You have to sell lies as hard as you can, propaganda, indoctrination. But truth is apparent, and once people see it, I like to think they get it.
Yeah, and I'd feel the same way, that he's going to bring some conversations to the table that need to happen. But we already see the Democratic Party and the Republicans, they're not interested in debates and forums. So the vast majority of Americans, what they're hearing is, oh, that's a crazy anti-vaxxer. Yeah, he's part of the Kennedys, but don't trust him. And I would caution people to put their faith in that again. I mean, Ron Paul played a role. He woke up a lot of people who are now doing great things. But even now, looking back, I have to question and wonder, like, wow, was that causing more people to put more faith in the system every time, right? And especially now, RFK is running the Democratic Party. So there might be people who now think, okay, maybe I will be Democrat one more cycle, one more round, and it continues. Well, on another topic that I know that the rabid online audience wants to hear your perspective on, the virus question, which I've asked as many people as I can about this, not necessarily because I feel like I have a stake in the matter so much as I don't really know what to make of the topic in terms of putting the evidence and that discussion aside. I want to speak for a moment about like the community around that. And I mean, I know you see it in your comments and on videos and online, like this sort of, there's lists of people like you and I, oh, they won't touch the virus question. It's become this kind of like, you're either with us or against us. Before we get into the actual topic and what you think about it, what do you say to that kind of approach, activists online or in person who are taking that like, oh, because James does good work, but he doesn't say this one thing I say, he must be controlled, et cetera.
Yeah, well, let me ask you, in your years of doing this, have you ever seen one of those litmus tests that are actually useful and productive? Because I have talked to people who don't believe 9/11 was an inside job. I have talked to people who believe climate change is the universal threat that we're all facing. I've talked to lots of people that I disagree with on certain things. I agree with on other things. Have you ever seen this kind of thing where it's like, if you believe this, you are excommunicated for all time, you're a shill, I will never listen to anything you do? That's actually useful and productive?
No, I've seen it be very destructive.
Yeah, and almost as if that's a plan, right? I've talked about Sunstein and cognitive infiltration many, many times, and the point that I keep going back to is Sunstein wins when we start accusing everyone else. You're a shill. You won't say what I believe. You won't say this. You won't do this. Once we start dividing ourselves like that, Sunstein and his type win.
Yeah, and I think that's, for those who don't know the references, Cass Sunstein, James has done some great work on that, specifically talking years ago about infiltrating conspiracy theorist groups to cause division. And I don't have the paper or the document that says that that's what the No Virus crowd is a part of. They might be unwittingly participating, but I do think there are some genuine questions they ask. But overall, my problem, and I think this has been not very well received, is to say you are acting like, I use the word rabid because that's the approach that I get. I get emails, angry emails and things, because if you don't say that right thing, you're not doing good work.
And can I just underline that? Because I think the Sunstein idea is not to have everyone's on the payroll and everyone who's saying this is somehow controlled or something. No, most of the people are I'm sure, organically oh yeah, he is a shill. Oh, I don't believe that. Are doing it organically. But I think there is a deeper operation to split people apart who should not be split apart at the biggest crisis point in human history. I do not say that lightly. We are here in the crisis point of the explosion of the past few years. And suddenly the people who are in this crater with us are going, yeah, you get out of my crater. You're a horrible person. It's ridiculous.
So I'll take their side for a moment. I think they would probably offer, because this is what I've heard, well, because the no virus question is the like solving that will make the whole house of cards crumble. I don't agree with that. I mean, I'll say before you propose is now we've seen climate change as another part of the narrative, and these folks I think are really exclusively focused on it. If we just get the world to see there's no virus or that it hasn't been isolated, which are legitimate questions, then the whole house of cards will crumble. And I think they're missing that these people will use alien invasions, terrorism, communism, climate change, anything. So it's not just if they don't need the pandemic card if they they can jump to something else.
I'll go deeper than that because, oh God, I wish there was someone asking me this question who was in that camp so that I could ask them this, but you will stand in and you will answer this question. So my question for you, all of you and you, is if, let's just say for the sake of argument, if there was something, either a virus or something that comported to that idea of a pathogenic thing that could be spread from person to person, if that existed, would governments have the right to violate your bodily autonomy?
I'd say no.
I would say no too.
Either way.
Anyone who says yes to that is not part of the health freedom movement, right? I think so. To me, it's missing the entire point of the past few years, the entire point of the biosecurity state, which is, hey guys, there's this communicable disease thing, therefore we get to violate your bodily autonomy. It is not an answer to that fundamental problem to say, oh, but that communicable pathogen doesn't exist, therefore, ... No, you have to attack the base philosophical issue. So the hypothetical question, because I know there are people who will say no virus, no pathogen exists whatsoever. There are many different iterations of this. Some people who don't even believe in bacterial infections and things.
Immune system doesn't exist.
And then other people will say, no, we're not saying that. We're saying this. It seems like a Maud and Bailey argument to me. But at any rate, the hypothetical question at base, if it existed, if there are communicable diseases, does that give the government the right to violate your bodily autonomy? I say not only no, I say hell no. Absolutely not. And if you agree with me on that, then we can absolutely talk about the details of how disease works.
I tend to feel the same way. If we're on the same page of that, then yes, there are other discussions to be had. Nobody's saying the no virus question should be censored or whatever, but I don't think it's serving the community to have lists of these people are on the... And the other thing is, it's sort of that us versus them is so black and white that because if you don't interview this person or if you don't ask this question, then you must endorse germ theory and everything else that goes. There's no kind of room for kind of maybe there's some gray area.
Because I think I've heard you say this before, and I've always felt this: germ theory and terrain theory are not incompatible.
Yeah,
they go together because yes, if you have a healthy immune system, that will. And how do you get a healthy immune system? By nutrition, by sunlight, by all of the things that terrain theorists will talk about. Absolutely, you have to have a healthy terrain, and then whatever pathogens are going to do whatever they do are not going to affect you in the same way, right? So that's...
Well, one other question on that. Have you happened to come across the work of Christine Massey, the one, she's filed the FOIA request from different governments around the world. I haven't looked at every request. I have a feeling that there could probably be other reasons why they're coming back saying we don't have the, I mean, because if anybody's ever filed open records requests with government, even if you say the exact things you're looking for and you do it perfectly clear, sometimes they can come back and say they don't have stuff they do have, and you file it a different way with different words, and you might get it. So I feel like they're, I don't know, but what have you come across that idea that there's no governments who are, they're claiming they have no responsive documents?
I can't speak to Massey in particular and what she's done, but I do know of the idea of this, and all I can say is I put in a FOIA request for the government to tell me that it isolated terrain, and they didn't have anything. Therefore, terrain theory doesn't exist. I don't know what to say. No, this is not. So are we really going to take as our standard what the government says or doesn't say, or they say they don't have anything on this, therefore it doesn't? I don't think that's the right.
That backs up my theory now.
I don't think that's quite the bottom line smoking gun at any rate.
Okay. All right. Well. And let's end then with I think the bigger picture, and you touched on it a moment ago, which is the biosecurity state. And you, as soon as COVID started, you did some great documentaries and podcasts trying to paint that picture for people of where this is really going. And I think it's become more clear. We now have people, again, talking about digital identities and passports and social credit scores when there were really nobody talking about that other than a handful of people 5 years ago, 6 years, one of those people. Now we're at a point where people recognize this stuff's on the horizon. People are concerned about AI, concerned about transhumanism, concerned about the pandemic treaty and what's going to happen and all that stuff. What would you offer to anybody listening are some next steps they could take to prepare? I mean, mentally, physically, spiritually, whatever you want to take it.
Yeah, well, again, it would depend on your particular situation and the million variables, but something that Tim Kilkenny said when he was interviewing me on Revelations Radio News last year, he said, the best way we can fight back, if everything they are doing right now is about trying to make you sick, and I think we can all agree on that, all of the isolation, quarantining, masking, all of this stuff makes us sicker, obviously, and is obviously not about public health. Well, what they are trying to make us sick in order to the self-fulfilling prophecy of the scamdemic. You're going to get sick, and then everyone gets sick. Hey, look at that. What we can do to counteract that is to be healthy as much as possible in our own personal. So yes, absolutely, and that was the big kick in the butt for me as I'm sitting there. Yeah, I'm working crazily on all these documentaries and stuff, trying to get this information out and letting my own body go to shit. Oh, can I say that? So yeah, absolutely. Yes, we have to take our responsibility for our own health first and foremost, our family, and then we can start hopefully spreading that out to others by being the change. I know you've heard it before, but that is such an important part of this.
Yeah, just leading by example, and I think that just in your personal anecdote of like missing out on the gym, like you said, that is exactly what they wanted. Any potentially good habits you had, whether that's relationships, friends, just social interaction, sunlight, all that stuff, out the window. Get a depleted human being, inject them all that fun stuff. So maybe the challenge is June 2023, get James back in the gym challenge. And so the only thing left to do, I think, at this point is for each of us, as you were saying, James, to take personal responsibility for our lives and to be an example, to lead by example. I think that's why people might look to you or myself or anyone here, is because we're just taking action. You know, we're not sitting around waiting for other people. And so if you listening feel inspired to do anything, make art, make podcasts, make music, go to the gym, take care of yourself, any of these kinds of things, don't wait around to do it. This system is not waiting. These people are working every day on their Agenda 2030, and I think it's time for us to have our own, what I'm calling Agora 2030 or Liberation 2030.
Let me just put in the plug for what you're doing, because when I think of leading by example, it's hard to think of a better person than Derrick Broze, who's doing everything. Freedom Cell, Conscious Agora, Conscious Resistance Network, all of these incredible activities that you're a part of that are all based on doing. And that's what I love to see. People getting out there and motivating others to do things in the real world. It's wonderful to talk about them till we're blue in the face. Hey, I'm good at talking about things. That's what I do. But it's people like Derrick who are out there doing it, who need your support. So I hope people who are watching this will do so.
Thank you, brother. Well, it's been a good conversation, guys. This is Derrick Broze with James Corbett. We're in the UK. Until next time, remember, you are powerful, you are beautiful, and you are free if you want to be. Peace.
Next, let's take a look at this clip from Kim Iversen on the Ukraine and Russia conflict.
Story here. John Mersheimer, you may remember him. He's one of the best known analysts of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. He's the University of Chicago political science professor, also West Point grad who served in the military as an Air Force officer. He's the one who gave the talk about why Ukraine is the West's fault, which he gave 7 years ago. He talked about NATO expansion being a thorn in Russia's side and warned that there could be a war if the West continued down that path, which he ended up being very accurate. And that talk has been seen now over 30 million times. Well, 2 weeks ago, he gave another speech for the nonprofit committee for the Republic. And I want to go over it with you because it's really important. So this time he talks about the current state of the war and how it's going to end. In fact, he gives the lead in as to what his talk's about. Let's go ahead and play that.
There are three basic questions on the table about Ukraine. The first is what caused the war? Number two is what's the state of the war today? Where are we at the moment? And then the third question is what is likely to happen moving forward? And I don't want to talk about the causes of the war. I may say a few words in the conclusion, but I'm not going to talk about the causes of the war. I want to focus mainly on where this train is headed. But to talk about where the train is headed, it's important to talk about where we are today first, and then segue in to talking about the future. And I'm going to make two arguments. The first argument is that there's no chance of a meaningful peace agreement. There may be at some point in a distant future a ceasefire, and that will then turn into a frozen conflict. but the chances of resolving this in any meaningful way are remarkably small, in my opinion. And then my second argument is that the Russians are going to win the war. They're not going to win a decisive victory, but they're going to end up conquering a huge chunk of Ukrainian territory beyond what they already have. And they're going to take Ukraine and make sure it remains a dysfunctional rump state.
Okay, so these are the points that he's going to talk about in this. He does touch a little bit on how we got to this point. Of course, he doesn't cover it in depth because he's already done that. 30 million people watched it. But he does touch on it a little bit. This is what he has to say.
Here, the United States was really in the driver's seat to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border. And that strategy or policy, of course, included NATO expansion, EU expansion, and turning Ukraine into a pro-Western liberal democracy. Those three policies packaged together were all designed, again, to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's borders. The Russians made it unequivocally clear from 2008 forward that this was unacceptable and that it was not going to happen. And they made it clear that they would destroy Ukraine as a functioning society before they would let it happen.
Okay, so very much making it clear. Now, he goes into, when he breaks down sort of what is going on now, before he gets to the actual war, he's going to go in and explain the actual battlefield at one point. But prior to that, he's talking about the existential threat and the goals of each of the players involved in the war. And those players involved are obviously Ukraine, Russia, and then there's the West. And the West can be sort of broken into the United States, which is the main player for the West. But then the European countries are also sort of minor players, even though they're very much right there in Europe. But they're still sort of minor players in the entire grand scheme of things. So he starts off first by talking about how the goals of these various different players oftentimes will result in an existential threat to another one of the players. So here he is. He's going to talk about the United States' goals in this war, in this conflict, and how these goals by the United States are an existential threat to Russia. Watch this.
Once the war starts, the United States has to stipulate what its goals are vis-a-vis Russia. And we have made it clear that our goal is to defeat the Russian military in Ukraine, to wreck its economy, and to, in effect, knock it out of the ranks of the great powers. There's also all sorts of rhetoric coming from the West and people in the administration, right, that make the argument that we should go beyond that and that we should pursue regime change. Then we should put Putin on trial. And there's even lots of talk these days about breaking apart Russia the way the Soviet Union broke apart in December 1991. This is the second layer of the existential threat. So there's no question that the Russians see themselves facing an existential threat. And I might add here that I have a number of friends who argue that the Russians are not facing an existential threat. My response to them is very simple. It doesn't matter whether you think they're facing an existential threat. The only thing that matters is whether they think they're facing an existential threat.
Okay, so he breaks that down. There's two reasons why Russia feels like they're having an existential threat. And that is the first, which is the NATO expansion, which is what he's talked about in the past and also touched on briefly, which was that the goal is to make Ukraine a Western bulwark right on Russia's borders. That's an existential threat. The second existential threat is wrecking its economy, knocking out of the ranks of the great powers, potentially regime change, potentially breaking Russia up. That these are all existential threats to Russia. So that is why they're pursuing what they're pursuing. Now he's going to talk about Russia's goals in this entire thing and who that's an existential threat to. Here's that.
Now, a lot of people think that the Russians are bent and have been bent since February 22nd, it's February 24th, 2022, in conquering all of Ukraine and it absorbing it into a greater Russia. The Russians have never been interested in that, and they're not going to try to do that. What the Russians are interested in doing is capturing a substantial portion of Ukraine and also making Ukraine a dysfunctional rump state. They have already formally annexed 4 oblasts plus the Crimea. And they have made it clear they have no intention of giving that territory up. I might add here that they don't control all 4 of those oblasts completely at this point in time. But those 4 oblasts plus Crimea make up 23% of Ukraine's territory. I also believe that they will take the 4 oblasts that are immediately to the west of those 4 oblasts, and this includes Odessa and Kharkiv. And once they do that, they will control 46% of Ukrainian territory.
So he goes on to say, controlling 46% of Ukraine's territory is obviously an existential threat to Ukraine. So the United States' goals are an existential threat to Russia. Russia's goals in this war of taking much of that eastern land from Ukraine, the Russian native speakers, is obviously an existential threat to Ukraine. He goes on also to talk about in this that Russia is not going to expand. Some people believe that Russia is going to expand and try to take all of Ukraine. He says that's not something that they want to do. They don't want to swallow a porcupine. He says that that many people in the western part of Ukraine they speak Ukrainian, they're very much nationalistically Ukrainian, and they hate Russians. And so there's no reason why Russia would want to take over a region that hates them so fiercely and will constantly give them headaches. On the other hand, they could take the Russian territories that are mostly filled with ethnic Russians speaking Russian, and those people are not going to be resistant to being under the rule of Russia at that point. To them, it's like Ukraine or Russia, okay. So he's saying that that's going to be ultimately their goal. Nonetheless, that's still 46% of Ukraine's territory. So that would be an existential threat to Ukraine. Now, if Ukraine also feels, and again, as he says, it doesn't really matter if you think Russia's facing an existential threat or not, as long as they think they are, that's the only thing that matters. Same thing for Ukraine. It doesn't matter if they're not actually facing an existential threat that Russia's just going to come in and take the Russian speaking and leave the rest of Ukraine. What matters is if Ukraine believes they're going to take all of Ukraine, that's an existential threat. But in reality, if Russia's goal is to just demolish Ukraine, to make it a rump state, obviously this is an existential threat to Ukraine, right? So that's pretty obvious. Okay, so he does talk about now Europe's goals and the threat. So this is kind of the minor when it comes to NATO. NATO, the United States is the major. Europe is sort of the minor in it. So this is what he says about Europe's goals and threat.
But I would argue that virtually every country in Europe depends for its security on NATO. This is not talked about much in the West. But the fact is that deep down, European leaders completely understand that NATO provides security for them. It's their security umbrella. And the great fear here is that if we lose in Ukraine, it will do significant damage, maybe even destroy the alliance. And therefore, people are deeply committed to making sure that that doesn't happen. And I sense that is, in effect, an existential threat.
He also mentions in his speech China, and he says that one of the existential threats that NATO and the West, and the United States in particular, might feel is that China's a bigger threat to the United States. And because of that, losing this war would showcase weakness that they don't want to showcase in the face of China. So that's one point he brings up. Now he's going to talk about Ukraine's existential threat, which I think is pretty obvious. Here it is.
Let me say a few words about the Ukrainians now. Their threat environment. They view the Russians as an existential threat. this is really a no-brainer. Given what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, it's clear that Ukrainians think they are.
Yeah. Obviously, Ukraine is experiencing an existential threat. And I don't think anybody should minimize that or ignore that Ukrainians, and we'll get into it, he talks a little bit about what's happening on the battlefield, and it is pretty atrocious what is happening. This is ultimately a proxy war between the West, United States really more fundamentally, and Russia, and Ukraine is really sort of stuck in the middle of all this. And what is happening to them is it's really, truly horrendous. So now he is going to talk about the battlefield. He's going to talk about what type of war this is, where we're at on the battlefield, and who's winning the war and who's going to win the war. Watch this.
Now, let me say a few words about the battlefield. It's very important to understand that this is a war of attrition. The basic goal of each side is to bleed the other side white. This is not a war of maneuver. There are no blitzkriegs here. This is Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali standing toe-to-toe and beating the hell out of each other. This is a battle like World War I, fights at Verdun, at the Somme, and so forth and so on. It's a classic war of attrition.
So he goes on to talk about what is needed to win a war of attrition, that these two are just pummeling each other at this point, and you need three things to win a battle like this. First, you need resolve, population, and then you need artillery. So when he talks about resolve, he says there's really no meaningful difference between the two. They both have the same level of resolve. Obviously, Ukraine has the resolve to try to remain a sovereign country, not to be turned into a rump state, not to be broken up in half. That is Ukraine's motivation. That's their resolve. So they have the resolve to stick this through because they don't want to end up being just a rump state. Russia has the resolve to see this through because they view this as an existential crisis as well. As an existential threat. They don't want a Western bulwark on their borders. They don't want nukes on their borders aimed at them. They view Ukraine as their little brother. They've viewed them this forever, Ukraine and Belarus for that matter. And they're basically beating the snot out of their little brother for even challenging them. That's ultimately the way they're feeling about it. They're saying, how dare you? You're a traitor to the family if you're courting these people over here that have made it clear that they do not like us, they want to challenge us, they want to break us up, they want regime change, they don't want Russia to exist, and you're playing to them, you're dating them, you're trying to marry them. We're going to make sure you can't even do that. So he says the resolve is no different for either side. They're both going to see this through to the end, whatever that end is. Population, he goes through the population of the two, and he says, going into the war, Ukraine had far less people than the Russians. It was about three Ukrainians to every 5 Russians in the battle. Now they're saying it's 5 to 1. So sorry, it was 3 to 1, and now it's 5 to 1 because there's been a lot of refugees. A lot of people have fled. So now people are leaving Ukraine. There's 8 million who have left the country, mostly men who fled. 3 million of those have gone to Russia, of those refugees. So graphics of this war, there are 5 Russians to 1 Ukrainian. So it's not on their side. The population is just not on their side. He also mentions during this, before we get to the artillery, and I'll let him explain that in a clip, but he mentions that in 2022, Ukraine had the upper hand in this battle. And they were kind of on the winning side of this. And that's often the case when you're invading another country. If you invade another country and it's their home turf, you don't have home court advantage, right? So he said Ukraine had the upper hand in all of 2022, most of 2022, but now Russia has the upper hand. It is 2023. He says that Ukraine has been preparing for this counteroffensive, which they're in the middle of doing right now. We're not seeing much. Even pro-Ukrainian analysts are looking at the current counteroffensive saying, it's not so great. It's pretty weak. And he said, Ukraine didn't even really want to do the counteroffensive. They're sort of being shoved into it by the West. They're being forced to do it. They don't really want to do it because they know that they're just being pummeled on the battlefield. So then he goes into artillery and he says, really, artillery is the determining factor of who is going to win the war. Now, remember, this is a West Point grad. He says that this is the type of stuff they learned when they were learning military strategy, is that artillery is the key. And this is what he says about the artillery difference between the two countries.
Then we come to the artillery imbalance. Almost all of the reports on that balance say the number is either 5-1, 7-1, or maybe 10-1 in the Russians' favor. This has massive consequences. Massive consequences. You just want to think about what this war is all about. It's two armies standing toe-to-toe, trying to kill each other with massive amounts of firepower. And one side has a 5-1 or a 7-1 or a 10-1 advantage. The side that's on the lower end of that ratio is in the deep kimchi. This is really horrendous. And by the way, that country that's on the downside of that ratio in artillery also is on the downside in the population ratio.
So this is why he says Russia's going to ultimately win this. It's not going to be, and he's going to get into the ending of this, whether there's going to be a peace agreement or how this is going to end. He's going to talk about that. But this is why he's saying Russia's ultimately going to win. They've got a population advantage over Ukraine. They have an artillery advantage over Ukraine, and they have the same resolve as Ukraine. So they're not going to back down. They're going to win this thing, and that's that. He then goes on and talks about, I want to play this next clip for you because I think it's really important to understand the death and destruction that's happening on the battlefield and how desperate Ukraine is on this. So watch this. It's very, to me, this makes me pretty emotional. But go ahead and watch this.
It's quite clear that Ukraine is engaged, from their point of view, in a total war. They have mobilized their entire society. They have soldiers who are as old as all of us out there fighting. They have old dogs and young dogs, lots of untrained people. It's because they're desperate. It's because they're desperate.
That to me right there, listen, and he's totally right. Russia's just sent in certain groups to fight this. They haven't even mobilized their entire military on this, and they're certainly not sending in untrained civilians into Ukraine. There's been some chatter about untrained prisoners that they sent in or whatnot, but for the most part, they have not mobilized their society. Ukraine is completely mobilized. This country is desperate. They're throwing old men at this war. Civilians, untrained people are in this war. And this right here is why I get very frustrated with, though I have agreed with John Mersheimer from the very beginning as to why this war has happened. The expansion of NATO. This is very much the West's fault. Poking the bear with Russia. Constantly aggravating them, getting them to this point, which is really, truly one of the faults of the United States. And they should do everything, our government should do everything that it can to put an end to this war, to seek a peace agreement, to back off from Ukraine, but they refuse to. They're just going all in. And the people of Ukraine are the ones who suffer. It's the people who suffer. And to think about old men, I couldn't even imagine my father, for example, being thrown into this war in order to potentially push back Russia turning the nation into a rump state, or to have untrained people being thrown into this war. That desperation is incredibly sad and horrible. And anybody who champions what Russia is doing, I have a very, I don't agree that Russia's doing the right thing by doing this. I don't think there's any war where there's the right thing, these are the good guys, and the good guys are going in and acting like Russia's a hero in this. People are being murdered, massacred. People who are civilians, people who are just given a gun for the first time and sent on the battlefield. That should make all of us sick. And it should make us sick that not only are the Russians doing this in order to just make an example out of Ukraine and to say, how dare you try to marry the West? I understand their anger, but I understand how the West got them into this. But we can't root for this sort of death. We shouldn't at least root for this sort of destruction. I came from, the reason my family is here in the United States is because there was a war in Vietnam where it was brother against brother. And literally in my family, I had an uncle serving on one side and an uncle on the other. It was brother against brother. And it is sickening. It's totally and completely sickening. And neither side ever feels like they're the bad guy. Every side thinks they're the good guy in the entire conflict. And the reality is the bad guy in this is the United States government and NATO that is continuing to push Ukraine, poke the bear of Russia, and throwing old men, young men, untrained people into this battle. This should make everyone completely sick. Now, where is this ending? What is going to happen? This is what Mersheimer has to say about that.
Now, let me conclude by talking about the possibility of peace agreement. Not going to be a peace agreement, meaningful peace agreement. Not going to happen. You'll get a frozen conflict. Why is there not going to be a meaningful peace agreement? Two main reasons. The first is the territory problem. The Ukrainians want their territory back. The Russians have made it clear they're not going to get their territory back. The Russians are not going to give up those 4 oblasts they annexed. They're not going to give up Crimea. And the Ukrainians insist on getting that back. Zelensky told Xi exactly this. There'll be no peace agreement until we get all our territory back. And the Russians are going to end up taking more territory. And they're not going to give that back either. How do you square that circle? Second big problem is the neutrality problem. The Russians insist that Ukraine be neutral. Right? They've insisted this from the beginning, and their argument is if Ukraine can't be neutral, they're going to wreck it. They're going to wreck it to keep it out of NATO, or if it's in NATO, it'll be ineffective because it's wrecked. Right? The Ukrainians, on the other hand, they don't want neutrality. The Ukrainians, for completely understandable reasons, want a security guarantee from someone. Well, there's the question of who is that someone? The only someone out there is the United States or the West or NATO. And that's not going to happen, right? That's not going to happen in ways that will please the Russians. The Russians will not accept that. So how do you square that circle, right? You don't. Two other quick problems here. One is the hyper-nationalism problem. There's a lot of nationalism in the air before this war started. It's morphed into hyper-nationalism, which means the hatred on both sides is off the charts. It's going to make a peace agreement very difficult. And then the other problem is that a number of leaders have made it clear that they lied to Putin about their commitment to the Minsk agreement. You remember the Minsk agreement, which was formulated in late 2015, was designed to shut down the conflict in the Donbass. And Putin was deeply committed to making the Minsk agreement work because he did not want to invade Ukraine. Angela Merkel, Francois Hollande, Petro Poroshenko, and Zelensky himself have all said they never had any interest in making Minsk work. And all they were doing was buying time to build up Ukraine so it would be in a better position to fight Russia. Trust? There's no trust on the Russian side because of this. So you see, you have a problem involving territory, a problem involving neutrality, hyper-nationalism, and zero trust. You're not going to get a meaningful peace agreement. You're going to get a frozen conflict. Let me conclude by just very briefly saying that what's remarkable about this case is that there were a significant number of people in the United States who argued that expanding NATO was going to lead to disaster. It included people like George Kennan. It included people like the actual Secretary of Defense, Bill Perry, and the actual chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Clinton administration, saying this was a disaster in the making. It included people like Paul Nitze and Jack Matlock, of course. There were a panoply of impressive intellects who said that this was a prescription for disaster. And you know what? They were right. And the end result is we are in this situation where enormous damage has already been done to Ukraine, most importantly, but to the West, to Russia, and to the United States. And with the passage of time, I'm sad to say, it's only going to get worse.
So that is unfortunately his prediction, which is that this doesn't really end, that this just marches us really into another very, very cold war with Russia, that the fighting itself will end. Russia will end up with 4 oblasts, maybe 8 oblasts. But Ukraine will be left as a rump state. But otherwise, thinking that we're going to go back to the way it was before 2022, it's just not going to happen. We're going to have this very hostile relationship with Russia. Probably you can add China to that mix soon enough. And so that's where we're at with this. And he's right. You know, Minsk, when they said, oh, well, the Minsk, you know, why would Russia say, okay, let's agree to a peace agreement when Minsk, now they've admitted, was just to buy time and that they didn't mean any of those promises? Why would Russia trust us after we've expanded NATO, after shaking their hand and saying we're not going to expand NATO? There's absolutely no trust there. So there's no reason for Russia, rightfully, to trust anything the West says. But that's gone, rightfully so. The one thing, though, is that in the end, you know, he mentions the nationalism and the hyper-nationalism, and that is one of the things that Putin has said that he's fighting in Ukraine is the Nazis, right? And we've seen there's definitely nationalism, there's definitely Nazis in Ukraine. That's undeniable, for sure. But Mersheimer is right when he says, now it's worse. This didn't make the problem better. It actually made it worse. The people who were hyper-nationalist, that were pro-Ukraine, totally against Russians. Because remember, the Nazism in Ukraine was really against Russians, against ethnic Russians, Russian speakers, and that's who they were targeting. Now that's worse. Western Ukraine is going to be even more so in this way. They're even more so going to hate Russians. And that is still going to be on their border. I mean, at the end of the day, Russia takes 4 oblasts. Guess who's still on their border? Ukraine. At the end of the day, that rump state of Ukraine, the Western whatever's left, decides to join NATO. Guess what's on Russia's border? Nukes in NATO. It doesn't really change that particular issue. NATO on my border, nukes on my border, Nazis on my border. Doesn't change that at the end of this. So ultimately, this is, I agree with Mersheimer in his analysis after listening to him. I think he makes a really great point that this is really ultimately just meant to hobble Ukraine, turn it into a rump state. It's not necessarily about those other things that have been listed. This is just meant to turn it into a nothingness, essentially, a rump state. So interesting talk by Mersheimer, very informative. He's been dead on the money previously, probably is again. So that's where we're at with that.
Last but not least, here is the interview from Ryan Cristian with Scott C. Smith about East Palestine.
Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. I have Scott C. Smith joining me today to talk about East Palestine, something that you know we've been talking about quite a lot. That's been one of the most horrendous situations, one of the most obvious cover-ups, in my opinion, that I've ever seen in my life. And it's a really astounding situation to see after 4 months that we're still having this conversation, not about how that we should be focusing on what happened, but that we're still even disputing. People are debating whether this is even something that happened. It's kind of blowing my mind. So joining me again today is Scott C. Smith, Chief Sustainability Officer at ECO Integrated Technologies, Inc., and one of the few independent experts that are on the ground in East Palestine, exposing the ongoing cover-up by the EPA and Norfolk Southern. So, Scott, thank you for joining me today, taking the time. I know you're very busy. How are you?
Great. Really appreciate you having me, Ryan, and these longer form segments in the media. And it's people like you that are going to make the media honest again. So much appreciated.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate that, man. And yeah, I mean, your work is so very important on the ground that so few are doing, which is it's kind of staggering to me that hasn't happened more, but I know why people are afraid to kind of rock the boat these days. But let's get into a lot of different things today about the risks and so on. But I want to kind of start with, so you're not involved with this, and something obviously caught your attention. So what was it that made you go, I'm going to go there and check this out?
Yeah, well, what I have done, this is probably approaching my 70th disaster. And
wow,
a little bit of background. You can see on my pinned Twitter, my pinned Facebook, it's the history. 17 years ago, I was wiped out in oil contaminated floodwaters in 2006. And everything, my business, 100 employees, I've walked the streets not knowing where anything is going to come to next. First thing I did is, try to, when you walk the streets and you see employees and people that not knowing how they're going to feed their babies, get baby formula, that profoundly affects you. So the insurance company declared my factory in a basement and did not pay. So I liquidated my life, my life savings, put everything back. We recovered. And in this 500-year flood in 2006 in upstate New York, there was oil contaminated floodwaters everywhere. And the white booms, the white sorbents, nothing was working. And I had a medical foam, a special foam in the corner that had a FDA approval, and the military was using, believe it or not, for our first responders and also military. In the event there's a sarin gas or a toxic gas attack, it's infused with a lotion, and it was the only material in the world that would not deactivate the lotion. And if your skin is exposed to attack, you scrub it down and you live. That started sucking up all the oil where nothing else was. So I decided if I was going to liquidate my life, restart over again, I became obsessed with oil and water and started using this technology. It was in the corner of my factory and building it out. So roll forward to 2010. I see BP. I reach out to BP and, no one's getting back to me. So I went down with a duffel bag, chartered my own boat, little fishing boat, and fishermen said, thousands of people before you, happy to take your money. Threw him my iPhone. I think it was an iPhone 2 or 3 at the time. I don't remember. And he's turned white as I started scrubbing, taking this material, and the oil started coming off. And then BP reached out to me, and then BP endorsed what I did in the technology. And that's really how I had an existing business wiped out in oil contaminated floodwaters. And that was kind of the birth of my, and remediation technology. So that's where I learned back in 2010 at the BP about I thought that's when I was naive when it came to sustainability. So in BP, actually, the people at BP were great. And that's where I found out Republicans, Democrats, elected officials. I can tell you, I sat at a Ritz-Carlton meeting, Mary Landrieu, senator, and all this stuff. I refused. They should do the right thing. I shouldn't have to, and I just refused. But that's where I was told, well, we're not, BP bought a few $1 million. It could have been hundreds of millions, but I'm too stubborn. I'm under a lot of stress. That's why I sleep at night, and I got to be able to look myself in the mirror. I will not participate in that kind of pay to play scheme, whether legal or not. I just, I abhor it, what's going on. So that's when I didn't pay to play, and I ended up having some death threats against me, and BP was great in protecting me. And I don't, and I fear nothing doing this kind of work. And that's when I realized I had oil spill contractors and even elected officials were never going to use your technology after BP endorsed it. It may have saved the shorelines from being burned. We don't want to get the oil out of the water quickly. We're all tied to the landfills. The more trips to the landfill we make. So hence the sustainability thing. And as I started this path, then I started going into all these other contamination events, Mayflower, Arkansas, water contamination, chemical spills, because I realized that, if I could help communities not have to go through what I went through my own disaster, I mean, my life will never be the same again. But we recovered and going to disasters and help people understand what's in their water. When you see this kind of corruption firsthand, it changed. And like I said, I'm pretty stubborn and passionate about it. So I started going to all these different disasters. And roll forward to East Palestine. I had somebody a resident reach out on Twitter and said, would you please come help me? And I usually get called in, or a community or somebody to call in, and And when I joined last year, I joined a company. I'm involved in multiple companies. I'm CEO of 2 other companies that I own, but I'm also involved. Have you seen stuff about toxic algae? Toxic.
In a general sense, yeah, I'm actually really interested in that and the real.
I'm heavily involved. I'll send you emails separately on that because we've got a lot to talk about. But I'm heavily involved, and in Florida, and nutrient that's a big threat to the human race because of excess nutrients. So last year I sold a couple of my patents. I have about 24 to a company called Eco Integrated Technologies, and they wanted me to join as chief sustainability officer. And part of the terms of my employment, I said to them, I want to continue to go into these disasters. I want to set a new model for corporate citizenship. Maybe corporations should do the right thing for the communities, not fun. Do the right thing, no strings attached. I want a budget. I want to go in if there's a contamination event. And, I believe if you really mean what you say, individually or a corporation, when it comes to sustainability, if the health of a community like East Palestine isn't sustainable, I don't really think anything else matters. If you don't have your health and you're getting cancer, does it matter whether or not you use a plastic straw? I don't think so.
Right.
So in starting to set a new rule for that, I went in there and started testing, and that's now I've made 8 trips out there, and the expression is you can't find what you don't look for. Right. I can't believe something so simple has really generated so many sound bites, but if you can't find what you don't look for, and I do feel very positively about East Palestine. It is like a tipping point. In all the disasters I've been to, I've never had so many experts reach out to me. For example, I have 5 experts, over 150 years of experience. 4 of them have to remain nameless. You'd probably recognize them in their institutions, but it's pretty sad that we live in the United States of America and people have to fear for their jobs for trying to get to the science. All the talk we have about follow the science.
Right.
And when you truly want to follow the science, people have to live in fear for their, but because of the media and because of journalists like yourself, Dr. Beatrice Gullum was able to find me. I did not know who she was. And and you've seen the press release that we put out. She reached out to me, and why she's so important is the burn pits in the Gulf War.
Right.
Believe it or not, it's easy to believe. Our government was telling the vets that it's mass psychosis, perfectly safe levels, you're fine. And what she was able to do is talk about, it's not a singular exposure to a singular chemical. It's how all these chemicals mix together. And she was able to help and diagnose all that. But until East Palestine, we've had some other events in the U.S. with dioxins. Yeah, but nothing like an intentional burn after a derailment. So we effectively have, for the first time in the continental United States, a burn pits similar to the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point for people. And really quickly on your point about you can't find what you don't look for, I think the reason that got so much attention, and rightly so, is because it's an easy thing for people to understand. The average person sees that, and it's a very clear example: corruption. Yep. Right? Knowingly avoiding things you don't want to find. And that's a really important point. But I actually just did a focus on the burn pits in the context of the larger discussion. And that's just one part of it, but showing that this is a real, I actually went over a couple different studies, one from in regard to the Arctic, and a town in the Arctic that has high levels of dioxins in mother's breast milk, despite the fact that they don't have any dioxin sources within 500 kilometers, and they prove that it came from American sources, and all these different overlaps. And so it's a really important conversation. So I'm glad you bring that up, because it's been a long track record. So please continue on the dioxin side.
Right. I mean, and all these, see, this train that with this controlled burn, the other thing is the weather patterns that day. And the team of experts I have, we're developing an interactive map, and I'd love to come back and give you updates. It's not,
please.
We're taking all my testing and developing an interactive map. And when that burn was happening, there was a thermal inversion. which is the worst thing that could happen for the plume. It did not move. It just kind of hovered over the ground. And I am no weather expert. I'm no mapping expert, and I'm really appreciative and very glad to have these people around me. And I think this will be very telling. But the other thing is, for every 10 chemicals, you have 1,000 different combinations. There's about 50 different chemicals. So think about that, 50,000 different all the standards in the US are based on basically, like OSHA, it does not assume that you're exposed 24/7 and a singular exposure to a singular chemical. So it is completely disingenuous. And it's a false narrative when and let there be no doubt, the PR people and the lobbyists are in charge, and it's unfortunate the power they wield over the agencies. It's got to change. So citing a singular exposure to a single chemical or saying things are safe is just simply not accurate whatsoever, because there are no standards. And that's why we're doing what we can with the blood testing and other testing. And I'm taking my ground results. And also, it's unfortunate, but I think that we're the only ones. I'm the only one looking for dioxins in well water, soil, and sediment. And we're accumulating a lot of data. And also, we have been able to accumulate control data where the plume was not. And there's something called a fingerprint, whether it's dioxins or these other chemicals. And the fingerprint is different, meaning the mix of chemicals identified, whether dioxins or not, in the plume impacted area versus the non-plume impacted area. And that's a big deal.
Right. I was actually just going over that local report, which is one of the few people covering that, showing that exact point and talking about what you're finding. So I think it's clear that it's your opinion, and tell me if I'm wrong, that they're well aware of this problem and just actively gaslighting people as the comparative point to the burn pits in Iraq and elsewhere. Is that how you feel?
Yeah, I think the words coming out of the PR people calling all the shots, and from some of the agencies too, I don't think it's opinion. It's you're watching them. I've been there listening, saying it's psychosomatic, it's stress. Well, women's what just happened, women's menstrual cycles becoming very painful, heavy blooding, heavy clotting, rashes, people having seizures. I don't even need to do any testing to know none of these symptoms were ubiquitous in the East Palestine and its surrounding communities prior to the train incident. Something is going on there. So for PR people affiliated with the railroad to be orchestrating this narrative where it's just stress, clotting, blood, that doesn't come from stress. Little kids peeing blood, having kidney issues, that's not stress.
Right. Now, one thing that I have, if you want to comment on this, please feel free, but because it's a whole nother conversation. But one thing I find interesting is a lot of those symptoms you're describing are also, in my opinion, being covered up in regard to the injections that are being given. And so it's an interesting kind of overlap. And I don't know how we would even kind of piece that out. But either way, your main point is that simply it wasn't there before this happened. And now they're all suffering kind of this it seems kind of ubiquitous, different types of symptoms, but it seems like the entire area is similarly saying we feel different today. We can't think straight and all these different things. And then you got the more severe things you just described. I don't know how anybody honest cannot see that there's something going on. It's kind of mind blowing.
Yeah. And for me, follow the science. I think everyone's familiar with that term. And science should not be politicized or controlled by information officers.
Right.
And I tell all the government agencies, the railroad, everybody, open invitation to test side by side with me, split samples. But when you start, why do you need a public information officer? You shouldn't, because there are a lot of great, don't get me wrong, I've been doing this for a long time. And oversaid they're the workers at the EPA, great, honest, ethical people, but their hands get tied. Their hands get tied because of the undue influence from the $50-100 billion company that has all the lobbyists and PR people.
Right.
But there's a change. There's people coming together in a way I haven't seen, like journalists like yourself, asking questions, not going away. Very smart community. I've never had so many experts reach out. And, now with Dr. Beatrice Gullum reaching out and forming an alliance with me to test, it's very hard it's going to be almost impossible for the PR people on the other side of this to undermine what we're doing.
I wholeheartedly agree. I would say that's already the case and already has been. So it's only going to become more difficult for them to keep this under wraps. But it's definitely on the surface, and I think average people can see this. And it's like any other conversation we're seeing right now. It's basically all the facts that you can prove versus just what they say. And I don't know how that continues to float, but it's kind of amazing. We're at a very controlled flow of information. But so what was your first indication? So you're on the ground, just you're not sure what you're going to find. And what was your first indication that people were being misled?
Well, it's the fact that, it's not spreading. And I go myself as almost like a human and I volunteer to do this. So it's not a big deal to me, but I can tell you, I'm used to getting in and out quickly of these disasters, being exposed to oil here and there, not for extended periods of times. Yeah, you get dizzy and everything, but this was unlike anything I've ever experienced, because it would take me 48 to 72 hours after every time I went to East Palestine. Sore throat, scratchy, everything that the residents are describing, they're not making it up. And again, I do this, I volunteer, no big deal. But again, with all the health symptoms and what I experienced, I really don't need to see my testing results to know that something is going on. Right. But people are still getting sick. And they're usually at this time after an event, things subside. It is not. People are getting sicker. And what are we, 3 or 4 months into this?
Yeah, 4 months. And so let's focus on that for a second. So this brings me back to the point about the so-called controlled burn. Are we in agreement that that was not a controlled burn? That, like, by definition, the flow of oxygen was not there? So that, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and again, the experts that they will be coming forward eventually. It's my and again, I'm not an expert when it comes to controlled burns, but the people around me that have reached out are. Mm-hmm. And if I understand them correctly, there wasn't even a need for the controlled burn because there's an endothermic reaction going on, and they're accumulating data why the trigger was pulled on the explosion. It's all going to come out, and the NTSB is looking into this, and they have been in communication with that. But we still don't know. They're kind of pointing the fingers at each other. Right. We still don't know who really made the decision and pulled the trigger on the controlled burn. There are people out there saying it may not have been necessary. I'm not saying that as Scott Smith. I'm listening. And again, when you follow the science in a normal world, which we are unfortunately not in these days, when you follow the science, it's about debate, and you go back and forth in a professional way without demonizing anybody. And if we follow the science here, we need to understand what happened, because this will be scientifically explained.
Right. Well, I can't wait to hear that information. But so this brings us to the part about the way that went down, right? So in my opinion, and based on, again, the experts I'm speaking to as well, it seems very clear to them that this was the opposite of controlled. They dumped it on the ground. There was no ground cover, burned with no oxygen control. And so obviously that led to, and why don't you tell me what you think that amounts to? Obviously it leads into the ground, right? So more than just dioxins that were produced by the byproduct, what's the real risk there? And that's why I'm getting to what you said before about how I find it absolutely unreal that people are 4 months later, you step in there and get that immediate reaction. That clearly there's still something going on, not just the dioxin potential, or I don't know, maybe you tell me as the expert.
I first got there in February, like 3 to 4 weeks afterwards. And the dioxins, the SVOCs, and the whole list of chemicals, there were heavy oil, tanker cars. It was a concoction of toxic chemicals that I've never quite seen over 60 disasters. And then they lit it on fire, put it into the air in the dust. So it's going everywhere.
Oh, wow. Hold on a second. So you're saying that before the burn, there was already this concoction of chemicals swirling around?
No. When it derailed on February 3rd, I didn't get there to start testing till February 24th. Okay. But when it derailed, there was a concoction of chemicals that were spilling into Sulphur Run, into the creek, into the air. The volatile organic compounds like benzene, semi-volatile, and then you got dioxins. And my point is the mix of these, this toxic cocktail was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. We don't know how these chemicals are combining. And then, the controlled burn, I think, lasted for 3 or 4 days. And then they intentionally light it on fire. So when you light things on fire, chemicals combine, things go airborne. There's a whole host that's why the fingerprint, it's like, unfortunately, it's like a murder scene or a crime scene. So we need to understand the blood type or the fingerprint. It's not about the levels, because when I showed up 4 weeks later, it's about what is present, what should not be there, how did these combine?
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about that specifically, though. That the mixing. I mean, that's such a obviously valid point, and it's amazing to me that that's something that they're. I mean, it's not really. Again, we've seen how they've been operating, but it's shocking to see that they wouldn't address that. The obvious possibility of these things mixing and causing other new problems. But so, what were you? Let's go into what you found specifically, and then the dioxin specifically, because I've really been focusing on the TCDD and that the risk and the levels and the historic discussion. So, one, do you think that the dioxins alone are at a dangerous level? We've seen a lot of reporting on that, and then go into the mixing and what you think that might actually be causing.
Dioxin and dangerous levels of dioxin is debated in the medical community. So, but I can tell you this: there's something called body burden. I can tell you, I'm used to doing this, and dioxins are the fentanyl of chemicals. Well, they're measured in parts per quadrillion. I've never measured anything in parts per quadrillion before. I'm used to parts per billion.
Right.
And sometimes parts per trillion. So, quadrillion is 1,000 trillion. So those are very minute. It doesn't, and then there's every human has a different body burden. Dioxins don't just readily go away. You just don't pee them out. You just don't exhale them like some of these other contaminants. So, that's why the combining of all these things. So I can't tell you what there may not be a so-called safe level of dioxins that you can broadly say. Every human's different. What's safe for you, what's safe for me, depending on our life history and what our body burden or what our baseline dioxin buildup is from years of being on the planet. We just don't know.
See, that's a really important point. And just to since I mentioned these, I went over this. This is a report from the year 2000, and this is the discussion of it's Nunavut, Arctic Canada, and these are women who they're finding above the considered safe level of dioxins in their breast milk. And as you can see in the title, it's from North American sources. That's what they found, and they found that it was coming from sources all the way from the United States and ending up in this this Arctic area, and they had no dioxin sources within 500 kilometers. And so, right there, it shows you that dioxins can travel a long ways after going airborne. And then to that exact point, I dug this up from a long time ago. This is from CNN Environment from 1995, where they also report that as dioxins become airborne, they travel thousands of miles away. And to your other point, that even at this point in time, they were finding that they in hamburgers and chicken and pizza from fast food restaurants, Pizza Hut, things like that they were finding up to 8 to 150 times above the level that was safe. It kind of blows my mind that it seems that they act like we don't know about this today. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Why this seems to be a conversation that was like dropped and put away when they seem to have been focusing on it around 95 to early 2000s? Just your thoughts.
My thoughts, and again, I've learned over and over again, do not underestimate the power of the corporations over the traditional media. All you got to do is take out some advertising on it. They're and they're WKBN. I'll use their name. I believe that's the local station. They become pro railroad, like everything's fine. And this is the first time I guarantee you something's going on there, whether it's advertising or undue influence. The community doesn't deserve that. It doesn't deserve it at all.
That's very unfortunate. Go ahead.
And you hear stories. Now, I don't know what's true. It'd be fire chief's family, police chief, and all the donations going in, people's family members being hired by the railroad. I call that all undue influence. I'm not here to make moral or ethical judgments. All I have issues with that, but that's undue influence. And that's the problem in this country. And watch any TV, not that I watch it much anymore, but commercials are all big pharma. Right. Is this playbook any different? I don't think so.
That's an important point too, that of course they're going to frame that as, well, we're trying to help the community. We're trying to give them jobs and bring, but obviously you're right. I mean, all that does is then put their paycheck then depends on them not saying something that might put Norfolk Southern in bad light.
And the playbook is if they can get out of sight, out of mind, do pay people. And then when people get, God forbid, they get cancer 3, 5, 7 years, it's going to be because, oh, you smoked a cigarette in college or your lifestyle choices. It's not us. So that's very, very unfortunate. But the good news is people are really waking up.
Mm-hmm. Well, this brings to mind a point that I don't know if you're familiar with the Dark Horse podcast, but he put a point forward that I thought was really interesting, and this is just his opinion, but you can give me your thoughts on this. That he feels that there's been disasters like this in the past where they've learned from the fallout. That there's two things they could do. They can either take responsibility and maximize what they'll have to pay for it because they're saying, "Yep, we did this, and we're going to deal with it." Or they could, and either way, they pretend to take some level of responsibility. Or what they could do is try to keep it under wraps, do their best to actually spread the problem as far as possible, so it becomes almost impossible to argue that it was because of the local area. They're like, the same thing over there, and then as well as last out the time frame as long as possible. So, like you said, it gets conflated with other things, life choices. Have you seen that in your experience dealing with these disasters?
Absolutely. The ubiquitous, I predicted ubiquitous in the environment before you saw it publicly. I'm on record on it. But that's why I've done the control. Again, the non-plume impacted. So I've already blown holes and called into question this ubiquitous in the environment narrative because we found 9 less dioxins in the fingerprint from the non-plume impacted or control area versus the plume impacted area.
Yeah, that's as clear as it gets. And I made this point about the concept of trying to play into this, the idea that going back to that CNN article, for example, that they were well aware of a pre-existing background problem. And so their argument, as you know, and they've said is, well, we're not going to test because, or even we did, it was just kind of what was already there. That seems like a very disingenuous answer. But even you're also pointing out that it was higher than that anyway. But it just seems like blatant corruption to me.
Yeah. And then, and then there's the dust. They're digging up the burn pits. People are continuing to have vinyl chloride in their urine. And again, that's my understanding. It should be out of your system in 24, 48 hours. So they're being repeatedly exposed.
How do you explain that, actually?
Well, what I am learning is, again, we're not seeing any testing. They have what high volume air devices. And they're not testing for what's in the dust. I talked to the EPA yesterday and I said, well, you need to test the dust because the dust can be a major problem in this when you're digging up the burn pits.
Well, in that regard, though,
and the other thing too is you see the railroad funded the street fair recently. They're funding June 11th, July 4th. They stop digging the burn pits and putting the dust in the air for these town events. Now, they must know something that we don't. And,
that's very telling.
And I was out there recently, and I across from Ground Zero testing a private business owners, and I can tell you that dust is an issue. And now here's another thing: the contract workers, the townspeople with all the dust, our government, the governor of Ohio, had no problem with mask mandates, right? So when you should have a mask mandate, there is none.
That's actually
so the question is, I don't think Governor DeWine, any of the elected officials, any of our agencies, do they really care about people's health? Where are the mask mandates when you need one?
God, that is such, well, just to be clear, and I'm sure you probably agree, I don't think government should ever be mandating any of these things. But what's funny is that you make such an excellent point that it's going to resonate with my audience so well. Go ahead.
For the record, I agree with you. I don't get it. This should not be about politics. I'm an independent and but I agree with you. I believe in individual choice.
Yeah, I'm sure that was clear.
I think go into a radioactive area, that's their choice if they really want to do it.
Right.
But
I think that,
but if our government started this mandate thing, they could at least suggest to people or strongly recommend. And I make that point because of the pandemic and all these mask mandates as to, well, where's a mandate? If you ever might want to have a mandate, it would be for East Palestine when it comes to masks.
Right. No, just to be clear, I'm sure that was clear for most people anyway. I just want to make sure that people didn't think that's what you were suggesting. But so the point though is, again, that's going to resonate with my audience a lot because we've really been knocking down that illusion. Their own studies, it's not statistically significant in reducing transmission. But the point is what we're talking about now are dust particles, which masks will be able to stop. And so that's a really interesting point, that it's at a moment when it actually finally makes sense scientifically, they don't have anything to say about it. I think that right there alone is such an obvious point. But so back to unless you have any more thoughts on that, go ahead. But back to the dust itself, if I'm in regard to vinyl chloride, at least my minimal research, and I'm not an expert, shows that that's not something that should be lingering, right? Unless, is it the dust that makes it continue?
Yeah, that's right. Something, if you're digging up ground zero every day, these people are being exposed every day to vinyl chloride and other chemicals, and they keep getting symptoms. So there is a source somewhere.
Right. That's what I'm wanting.
You can't find what you don't look for. If you don't test the dust particles, why can't I get a straight answer from the government agencies? Why aren't they testing the dust for dioxins? Well, you can't find what you don't look for. If you don't look for it, you don't have to report it. And you can say, oh, it's stress, it's mass psychosis. These symptoms are in your head.
Man, I mean, that's just absolutely wild. Well, since you're mentioning the symptoms, what have you been seeing and people on the ground who you're talking to?
Well, there's like an epidemic, and I spoke about it recently in an interview, a week or so ago, but I had no idea until 10 days ago about the female issues. Very heavy menstrual cycles, clotting, pains, rashes, and none of this existed before. And it's prevalent all over town, and even in some people that moved away, kids being affected. I mean, breathing issues, rashes on the face, and people having seizures.
Right. Well, in regard to the ones that, how many have you seen that are things that would be like, in my experience, I've seen veterinarians diagnosing animals with chemical poisoning, or people getting what they actually call chemical bronchitis. Like, has that been something that is prominent?
I've seen some diagnoses like that, but talk about undue influence. You have very few doctors that will order tests but there are doctors that are growing awareness of this, that are reviled, and they rule out. I've seen, obviously I have to protect residents because of HIPAA and their medical and health, but I've seen the chemical diagnosis from doctors, and I've seen where they're ruled out of every possible thing, infections, everything else. It has to be some form of chemical exposure. It's how and why. That's what we have to figure out.
Right. Well, this brings me to an interesting point that you already went into. And it's interesting you framed it this way, because it does make a lot of sense. You talked about the previous disasters and how it was about the waste disposal kind of, racket, it seems. And there's a conversation to be had here in regard to clean harbors and all these different groups they're using. So I wanted your thoughts on this. First, on just your general perspective on how that might be playing the same factor in this disaster, but whether or not these areas they're shipping to even have the ability to deal with the things that we know are in the disaster, the dioxins, the PFAS, things like that.
I won't, the name, you just recently used a name. I won't say the name, but I was told point blank, in remediation, we'll never use your technology. We own the landfills. We make our money by not getting the oil out. We don't want the oil out of the water quickly. Man. So once the remediation is a huge business, and a lot of these investment groups that are demanding ESG and sustainability, they all own these companies. And you could do getting the word out and educating people about all this. But again, the remediation ends up to be an annuity stream for a few corporations. The power of their lobbyists and PR people are not to be underestimated.
Yeah, and it's an incredible thing to realize this for some people, but we've talked about this in just voting in general, but the lobbyists, the moneyed interests, it's provable that we live essentially in an oligarchy in this country, where they have complete control to make things happen or not happen based on their influence. And the average voter, if has any influence at all, it's a different discussion, is clearly, I think it was a Princeton study that basically found that I think it was near zero, minuscule effect on the outcome of policy just in our voting process. And that's kind of what you're talking about, but the specific part of these kind of lobbyists. But for that note, since we're, talking about it, I think what I'm getting at with this is clean harbor seems to be a clear focus for a lot of this. And I've talked, and I would play them, but they're about 10 minutes long, and I'd rather take the time to speak to you more. But I spoke to them on the phone. I called both of these locations, or three of them technically, and by their own testimony, they do not have the ability to deal with the dioxins. They're not even doing incinerators. They're burying this stuff in landfills for the most part. And that's dioxins or PFAS. They're not able to do it. And so it just kind of shows you that there's maybe it's what you're saying. This is a allowance to continue the problem, or it could just be profiteering, knowing that they don't want to expose what it happened. I mean, either way, it's corrupt. It's criminal. And it's spreading the problem around like we were talking about earlier.
I wasn't aware until you had Clean Harbors is involved in East Palestine.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Clean Harbors is three different times they've shipped to three different locations. I've called on these and spoken to them directly, and most of them don't even have incinerators they're using, but even the ones that do are telling them that they're not even using that, and they're doing different treatments. And so on the record, they're telling us they're claiming they have no discussion about dioxins. They're not even being told that's what's in this, even though we know that it is. And so they're spreading this around by not treating it properly. And that's all very clearly on the record, but I don't know if you want to comment or not, but I think that's an important part of this.
None of that is surprising to me. I've seen it before. I've been so focused on trying to help figure out the health issues and what people are being exposed to. I haven't looked into that, but that's great that you looked into that.
Well, I'll definitely send you some.
I do think, though, I can tell you from the calls that I get from government agencies and all my social media being monitored, the fear. Here's the good news. East Palestine's a turning point, because I've never seen so much support come and people come together from all walks of life. It's very important. The way that the average, honest, hardworking, tax-paying American citizen, which is probably 90% of the population or more, the way that a lot of this corruption can be called out and defeated is coming together in places like Twitter and social media, because I can tell you that's what the government fears. That's what all these people fear. And the funny thing is, we were told follow the science, but they fear the science. Right. They actually fear the science.
I completely agree. And really what they meant was follow the narrative, right? And we are the science, as Fauci made very clear, right? So that's the whole point, is kind of just follow what you're told, but yeah, I think this is clear. It's a lot of engineering, social engineering, and keeping people in when the facts on the ground make this undeniable. And so I think you're right. I think that there's a lot of concern here that when people come together, that they will be able to make something shift. And obviously, one thing I always say here is vote with your dollar. We see that being a real concept today. And that's Norfolk Southern, anybody else, that your dollar matters more than anything else to them. So that's how you should make a difference if you can. But let's go ahead and talk about the environmental impacts and how you think this is going to go forward. I mean, obviously you're predicting, I mean, you don't have a crystal ball, but with what you're seeing on the ground, right? The numbers that you're seeing, and not even getting into the unknown combinations and what that might be doing. What do you see happening here for these people? Especially in 4 months, they're still getting sick.
They're going to have to, the soil, and it really needs to be thoroughly analyzed. What needs to be done? I think they need an option to be able to sell at, maybe they take appraised value for the homes and 2 times, 1.5 times, and the railroad buys them out. I mean, I think it would be far cheaper for the railroad to do the right thing and also, stabilize or preserve reputation. But instead, when they hire all these consultants and PR people to run the show and undermine the community, that's just that, it's not going to work. It's not going to work in East Palestine.
And they hired the classic company, off the top of my head, I can't remember, you might remember, that was involved with the EPA and many other cover-ups of the past that are even openly called as such by the corporate media today. And on that same note, EPA famously lied about the safety of after 9/11, right? So there's all these very clear overlaps to that, and how it's kind of a institutional problem, captured agency kind of a reality.
That's right. There's captured agencies and captured media. Let there be no doubt about it.
Right.
That's why the PR people are hired for so much money. They go out and they capture the media and they capture the agencies. But
yeah, oh, absolutely. On the note of the land discussion, a lot of people are, and rightly so, are very concerned about that discussion in general. Some people even argue that that might have been the entire reason this happened. I clearly think that this is more of a classic cover-up, and that might be just a byproduct of it. But either way, Norfolk Southern is already showing that it doesn't want, on the record now, like trying to dismiss these lawsuits, and we can go into that in a second, but that they're buying the property out from under them. It's clear that it won't be full value. I think they've already kind of insinuated that more than once. But do you think that there's a dynamic there? Like this is an important area in regard to the food chain, that kind of stuff. So any of your thoughts on there maybe being a dishonest tactic in there and trying to, sweep this up?
Yeah. I mean, I think I saw that language about making up the difference, and no one knows what there's all kinds of games,
Yeah.
They have unlimited money and battalions of statisticians, and they can basically manipulate any form of data, whether it's testing results or real estate values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we'll have to wait and see, obviously, but I'm not going to begrudge anybody from wanting to get the hell out of there and wanting to, be somewhat compensated, hopefully more than their house is worth, which is what even Congress was pushing. But I honestly don't think that's going to come to pass. And we could finish by talking about this, which I really think is an important kind of follow-up to this, which is, and this is what I was just mentioning. This is the New Republic, I think, but I've seen this in plenty of places. Norfolk Southern files motion to dismiss the lawsuit over the Ohio derailment, it's just such an insulting reality. And just to quickly read a couple points, then you can comment on this. It says the rail giant is looking to dismiss the mass class action lawsuit. For those who don't know, that means the individuals who they claim they're going to take care of are suing them collectively, and they're trying to stop that. It says Norfolk Southern is seeking to shut down the case, which is in fact a consolidation of over 30 separate lawsuits filed against the company by individuals. Quote, the first car to derail, this is Norfolk Southern speaking, did not belong to Norfolk Southern, nor did Norfolk Southern construct the wheel bearing that allegedly overheated, and caused the train to derail. And it goes on to say, in the motion, Norfolk Southern's lawyers labored to argue the plaintiff's array of claims fell short. And then they even have the nerve to mention their millions of dollars in financial aid. So give me your thoughts on that. And we can, there's a lot of things we can comment on in that discussion.
That's just a follow up on the PR playbook. So first of all, we're not responsible, but we stepped in and supported the community and the town fair and all, and we donated here and there. We're the good guys. We're not responsible. Go sue someone else.
It's just so insulting to our intelligence. I mean, that breaks down just taking the population of the town. That's like assuming it was $5 million, which I don't know what the exact amount is, and maybe it's more than that. But still, $5 million that's $1,050 a person. So clearly that doesn't even begin to be seen as supporting these people. And so it's just really frustrating. And overall, what they're doing is just like you said, passing the buck, acting like we didn't, we're required to carry vinyl chloride. And actually, if you could comment for me on the wheel bearing point. It's interesting they would say allegedly, right? Are they now starting to suggest that that's not what actually happened? What do you think?
I think that's more of leaving the door open where they can point the finger and blame the manufacturer of the wheel bearing or other components for the failure and not themselves.
Oh, I agree with that. But the fact that I think it's pretty clear, at least the narrative is that the wheel bearing overheated. They have the readings of the different temperatures. So I find it odd that they would say allegedly overheated. I'm just wondering whether they're trying to start a narrative or set something about, like blaming something else, or maybe that's more going on there. I don't know.
I think they're leaving the door open to blame something else. And that's the lawyer speak, where even when the criminal killed somebody, they're still the alleged criminal until the trial happens.
Yeah. Fair enough. But yeah, overall, I think it's very clear to anybody with two brain cells to rub together, anybody honest that can see that they're playing political games when people's lives are on the line. People are getting sick. Scott's been testing. You have levels that are far above what we are being told is safe. Combination of things we don't even know what's going to happen in that regard, and actively telling it. They're trying to turn down the lawsuits of people that need help, right? So, where do you see this going forward, and what are you going to be doing next in the future? And
well, we're going to organize sometime probably in later June or July, where I'm waiting for more test results to come in, and we're going to probably have another community meeting where we can talk about the results. And also have, the medical doctor that I'm involved with take questions, and maybe by then she'll have some, results in from blood testing. So there's a lot of evolving moving parts. It's just that we're staying in constant communication. And again, it's about following the science, following the logic. None of these symptoms being reported were ubiquitous in the community health prior to the derailment. It's that simple. That's really all you need to know.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Well, I really appreciate all your work there. I know your work is very important, ongoing, and I hope people will follow that. Let me know when you're doing these public meetings, and maybe I'll even fly out. I'd love to be there.
We'd love to have you there. We'd love to have you broadcasting it from there.
Yeah,
I'll be in touch, Ryan.
Outstanding. Well, thank you again. Anything else you want to leave us with? Your social media links, upcoming events?
Yeah, just the best way to reach me is on Twitter at Water Warrior 1 ONE. So
outstanding. All right. Well, we'll be touching base and going forward. And thank you for your work, Scott. It's important.
Right.
And
Thanks.
As always, everybody out there, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
Thanks again for tuning in to another episode of the Independent Review. Hope to see you all next week.